This past year saw a resurgence in conversations about race and power in the West, particularly here in the United States, where we as Armenian Americans were reminded that we live in a country founded on genocide, forced assimilation, and slavery, while America's ally, the Republic of Turkey, has nearly identical foundations. Upon witnessing the continuation of the genocide in Artsakh this past fall, Armenians are especially reflectant about our place in the world. We've witnessed the confusing conversations about where Armenians fit in the scope of global identity, whether it's with family at the dinner table or on Twitter and other social media. Today, we're here to give you all the context you need to address these questions.
Throughout history, Armenians have always been the bridge connecting different regions. Because of where Armenia is located, it is a part of the Middle East, Europe, Caucasus, and West Asia. This places Armenians into multiple categories, which are not mutually exclusive, but nonetheless can make it confusing when describing our identity to others, especially when 72% of Armenians in the world are diasporans, already struggling to discern what it means to be Armenian ourselves. Diasporans in exile who have become refugees generation after generation, fleeing genocide and persecution. Armenians also vary in appearance, many with darker complexion who could never be quote-unquote white passing, and many with lighter features who certainly could be. This is exemplified in the entrance of some Armenians into the U.S. at the turn of the 19th century, who had to prove their quote-unquote legal whiteness to enter the country, while others were discriminated against for their darker complexion, being called slurs like the N-words of the Central Valley. I'm Krista Marina Apardian.
And I'm Haig Minasian.
And you're listening to High Tug Talks, the official podcast of the AYF West. Today's episode, reflecting on Armenian racial identity with Kohar Avakian.
A cousin of Armenians talking in the world.
Kohar Avakian is a Black, Nipmuc, and Armenian scholar from Worcester, Massachusetts, and a PhD student in Yale University's American Studies program. She graduated from Dartmouth College in 2017 with a BA in History, modified with Native American Studies, where she completed a senior thesis on the history of legal whiteness in the U.S., focusing on the case of study of Armenian refugees in Worcester, the first Armenian community in America, on the ancestral land of the Nipmuc Nation, her tribe. For her doctoral research, Kohar is interested in situating the history of Armenian racial formation with a wider framework of settler colonialism, slavery, and Asian exclusion. While she primarily draws from historical photography and oral history research methods, she also seeks to interrogate archival silences and create space for alternative modes of knowing and being in the face of such absences. Her work strives to explore the layered histories of her Armenian, Black, and Native ancestors in order to illuminate the intersections of race, indigeneity, and genocide in the United States and beyond. Welcome, Kohar.
Hello, Kohar.
Happy to have you here.
Hello. Happy to be here.
So Kohar Avakian, on paper, very Armenian name, right? If no one had seen you before, they're looking at the paper and they knew what Armenian names were like, they'd say this is a super Armenian name. However, could you tell us a little bit about your background? Because it's not just Armenian, correct?
Correct. Yes. So my name is Armenian, and it was actually made into an Armenian name, or insisted upon that me and my sisters have Armenian names by my Black and Native mother. And not specifically that. I'm sure my dad also had something to do with it, and my grandmother. But my mom got the name book from my auntie Husmeeg, actually, back in the 90s. And she was the reason that we got those names. So on top of being Armenian via Lebanon, which is where my dad comes from, he came here in the 70s as a result of the Civil War. My mom is born and raised in Massachusetts, specifically Boston, but we have roots in Worcester, Mass as well, which is where my parents met. Yeah, but my mom is Black and Native American, specifically from the Nipmuc Nation of central Massachusetts.
You know, Native American history, it's like looking into the future, 500 years into the future, what could happen potentially with Armenians a lot of the time. And if that's the case, like I want 500 years from now for people to honor the Armenian memory or help revive the Armenian nation. So actually, would you be willing to give us some quick history on the Muk Tribe of Massachusetts? I'd like to hear a little bit about it before we get into the rest.
Of course. So the Nipmuc Nation we're known as the freshwater people of central Massachusetts. And our traditional lands are central Massachusetts, so modern day Worcester, which by coincidence or not by coincidence is the first city that Armenians settled in the entire Western Hemisphere.
It's true, yeah.
And the foundation of the first Armenian church. Yeah, all these connections here. So our traditional lands are in central Massachusetts, but also all over what is now New England. So upper northern Connecticut and northern Rhode Island. But we currently mostly find ourselves in what is Massachusetts. So, you know, like many indigenous peoples across this whole continent, across the entire world, we've seen a lot of violence through genocide, forced removal. But what we've also seen is sort of the overwriting of that history to be painted as this very much friendly encounter that is really a way of masking that genocidal violence that took place in central Massachusetts and all over New England. So basically, we find ourselves in central Massachusetts still, where we have lived since time immemorial, but it was a very much a sort of gradual legal process in that the encounter, first of all, a lot of us died from diseases. But I think that's often overstated because it wasn't just disease. So in addition to disease, there were forced conversions. So Daniel Gookin and John Eliot are often accredited in New England for establishing what we call praying towns, which are basically just fancy words for settlements where indigenous peoples here, including my tribe, the Nipmuc Nation, specifically in what is now, for example, Natick, Massachusetts, established these praying towns for the conversion of Native people, where we were forbidden from practicing our traditions, from speaking our languages. They also, this is also the time where they converted the Bible into Nipmuc, in our indigenous tongue.
No way.
Wow.
Yeah, so that exists, and it exists now at Harvard. And a lot of our artifacts are actually still existent in Harvard and other institutions that were born out of slavery,
which is
and
interesting.
built with slave labor.
Those were religious schools. Those were like
Wow.
probably the centers of conversion too. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And they were now like founded for the Christianization of, or the education of Native youth, for example.
Yeah.
So these praying towns really not only were ways to assimilate and forcibly convert Native people in New England, but in addition to that, you had King Philip's War in 1675. It ended with the killing of King Philip, who his Metacomet is his native name.
Yeah.
And that was the way the English sort of said, like, now that was the end of the war. But really, it was a longer structural way of taking over the land. So my people, the Nipmuc people, along with a lot of Native people, were interned and sent away to Deer Island. That's an island off of Boston Harbor. You could still go there today, and they were exterminated there and left to starve and die. So that's what, there's actually now every year an annual paddle there as a sort of commemoration for our tribe. There's so many different connections with the structure that was embedded into the landscape. And after that, a lot of natives were sold into slavery. A lot of them were put into English households in Worcester, what became Worcester after, the colonization of the land. A lot of the colonization happened through cattle, which is an interesting thing. Like, we didn't necessarily have enclosed spaces or any sort of sense of owning the land, because it was about taking care of the land and being with the land and being with your people.
Right.
And this is sort of, the first time that this structure, this capitalistic structure, was imposed onto the landscape.
So the community is still around, though. It hasn't found a revival. I mean, obviously.
Right. So our history definitely did not end there. I can even send you I found this very useful thing on our website by our our sachem, she put together the history, because a lot of it is known through oral histories, because a lot of the archives don't exist by design. They were purged, as we know all too well. So a lot of our tribe, we, based on many different, conflicts, whether it was the Revolutionary War or World War I or World War II eventually, a lot of our men would go fight. And as a result, women were left behind, and many of them ended up marrying freed enslaved peoples that traveled here up north. So our Native community, and as are many Indigenous communities in New England, or what is now New England, and the East Coast, is also very much a mixed Black and Native community.
I've noticed that before. I've met many Black people that have a Native American background.
Right.
But a lot of things that Armenians can kind of like identify with there and see and relate to that. But it also gives us a lot of hope and inspiration there,
Yeah.
It does.
It's
right.
y'all are on y'all are on the come up.
We're striving. We're living. We're raised by very, very many strong women. I think like that is something that's a real thing for our community.
Well, when you're talking to a non-Armenian in Massachusetts, let's say, you say African American, Native American, they can kind of piece that together into what that means. However, I feel like maybe Armenian's been a little bit more difficult to explain. How would you, to someone, if they're like, what is Armenia? What would be your spiel, or how would you simplify it so that they can, make a picture of it in their heads?
Yeah, I think Armenians growing up in the U.S., it's crazy how that's such a common experience to tell people what you are, and they're like, what is that?
Right? Everyone has their little spiel, their little like bullet points in their head or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I would actually, it's just funny how much it has changed growing up, but I would say in Worcester, there were established Armenian connections because of that history. Right. So that helped shape that the fact that people did know who we were.
That is true.
But then I was really confused growing up because I was like, how do I explain this, in terms that people would understand? And my dad being from Lebanon, that also shaped, how people would perceive us and perceive me. But I was always like, now I always say like an Indigenous group from West Asia, like that is how I have always understood myself, being a Black and Indigenous woman here, and being that my family comes from, what is now Turkey and then Lebanon. So I feel like that is the one term in describing Armenians, because we really were. And we really are everywhere. So
it is true.
True, we're citizens of the world for sure.
I know, and at this point,
every corner, and you keep learning more and more things about where we are. Like
it's so true.
Ireland, Brazil.
I put my last name in Facebook the other day. Apparently, there are Alpadians everywhere.
Yeah, we got cousins everywhere.
All over. So apparently I have to travel the world one by one and meet all of them now.
And you know what?
Exactly.
So what this means for Armenians is we're only going to get more diverse. We're going to have a lot more mixed Armenian families. We're going to have a lot more Armenians from all different cultures too. I mean, let's say they live in South America for 2-3 generations. So in general, it's going to be important for the Armenian community to be able to know who we are and know what race is and these social constructs, but also be accepting of the diversity that's already here but about to come as well.
For sure, which is why we're very excited to have you here with us today, Kohar. So you are currently working towards a PhD in American Studies at Yale. What inspired you to pursue that study?
Yeah, that is a great question. I would say it all started in undergrad. So I went to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, but sort of by chance. And it is also one of those institutions that was founded for the education of Native youth. Not saying that really had too much to do with my decision, but there is a pretty strong Native community there, which was great for me. So I majored in history, modified as Native American Studies, because they have Native studies there, which is also very much informed, how I see everything. And there I was finally able to take Native American Studies classes and African American Studies classes, which were, I finally, for the first time, was something clicked. I was like, I get it. So for the first time, I could hear my history narrated back to me and see myself represented. and that really made a big difference. But then, I definitely saw the absence and the erasure of Armenian histories or any histories of the Middle East or West Asia. They were always marginalized or completely absent in conversations. And I realized that might be the thing. Whenever you have a question,
and it's like a gap there, like
right,
yeah.
a gap or a question that has no answers yet, that's usually a good indicator. So I took a class called Great American Cities, and then I took a race and ethnicity course with the same professor, who is very much based in American studies. So I think that informs how I understand all these things intersectionally, because I did a project my sophomore year, I think, on Armenian. Like, that was the first time I really dug into it, and I feel like up to that I didn't really know. You learn things through AYS, and you learn things through your family, through your churches, through all of our organizations. I think if there's one thing we're great at, it's teaching. It's teaching history, and really we do it for ourselves because we understand the importance of preserving that history for us, by us.
Yeah. But there's so much,
and
there's a lot.
Because there's so much. Yeah, and I finally sort of dug in, and I was like, this could be a dissertation. Like, from that point, I was like, this is already in the making.
Mm-hmm.
And it all started when I don't want to say discovered, because it's always been there, but for the first time I encountered the Armenian legal whiteness cases. That was the moment where because there was such a disconnect between what I'd grown up understanding what Armenian identity was and what I was reading 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, something's not really making sense.
Mm-hmm. It got interesting at that point. You're like, look at that.
I was like, something's going on here, and it needs more. It needs way more attention, because why don't we even talk about this in our, when there's such a silence and a gap, I think I've always been very much interested in interrogating, the absence that's there by way of all the absences that exist in, our history.
Well, speaking of the cases, the law cases with the Armenians and proving their whiteness and that, this comes from an old social study of race and color and human head sizes, and could you give us a very brief kind of how did this a European study of race kind of come to where it is now over time? Would you be able to
Definitely.
summarize?
Yeah. There is no easy way to say that, this country, as we know, is built on genocide and foundationally built on top of anti-Black racism.
Mm-hmm.
And the opposite, or the sort of foil to that anti-Blackness, that is, and the anti-indigeneity that is at the core of this country, is the sort of, reverence for whiteness and the standard and this naturalization of the white hegemony, sort of structurally embedded in the surface. So in 1790, as a result of the Naturalization Act that was founded in that year, one had to fit into the category of free white persons in order to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. Yeah, you couldn't even become a citizen if you didn't fit into that category. So by design, it was a very exclusive. That was written into the Constitution.
Yeah.
So this country is literally founded on exclusion, and I think that has very much been overwritten as well. That a lot of people probably don't know that. In addition, at the time there weren't necessarily that many immigrants that were coming from, say, Asia, or that weren't very obviously fitting into that category. So it wasn't until the late 19th, early 20th centuries that you had what they call the racial prerequisite cases, which were basically, the opportunity, if you want to call it that, for a petitioner to sort of appeal to a court and petition to naturalize on the basis of their ability to demonstrate that they could assimilate into whiteness or that they were white. And John Tehranian is an author who wrote Whitewash, America's Middle Eastern Minority. And he talks about how it came down to how well a petitioner how well they were able to perform whiteness. And I often use that word perform because I think it's something that all immigrants during this time period came to do, not only out of, desire for citizenship, but out of necessity. And I'm saying that because I've read a lot of these cases and they're very explicitly exclusionary, and they come down to this history of eugenics. So this is the same time period, as you said, of blatant scientific racism masked as racial science. So that was the time period where they were measuring skulls, collecting bodies, obviously enslaving people, treating people as less than human. And that was so recent in our history. This is during Jim Crow and Asian exclusion. So some authors have even said that Armenian legal whiteness was sort of that way that they drew the line between East and West because they wanted to exclude all those that were sort of to the East. Because of this deep, deep racial hatred and fear of the foreign when it came to East Asians, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act was also during that time. The early 20th century was also called like the Americanization movement. That's what they called it. You can look it up. It's still there. And now they say, it's known today as being this deeply racist thing. But this is that time period when these ideologies were very much taught. This is also the period when indigenous people here across the country, across, the whole hemisphere, were taken away and put in boarding schools and forcibly assimilated and converted. So at the time, immigrants were also being put into these Americanization programs where they had to learn English. I did a lot of interviews for my research in undergrad of, for example, Worcester's community, because we were that sort of first community that experienced a lot of this very deeply assimilative, these very deeply assimilative processes.
Right.
Where, we weren't really allowed to practice our culture in public in the way that we would have been able to. No, for example, my family in Lebanon, we have these, because we are so spread around the world, I feel like we can view things so relationally because we have people in many different places. And that's what I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Yeah. For sure. These assimilation ideologies definitely have, prompt very real and also long-term consequences.
It reminds me of Turkification, like what happens to Armenians in Turkey. Or
I think about that all the time, especially now. The most blatant connection you could think about is, our Armenian siblings in Turkey that are literally in fear of their lives. And not safe, just practicing their cultures. It's the structure. That's at its core.
So we could kind of say that the foundation of Turkey was also racist and built on slavery and genocide.
We could definitely
right?
say that.
Lots of parallels here.
No
settler
wonder.
colonialism. Yeah.
Definitely.
It's a supremacist ideology at its core.
True that.
For sure. Well, one of the consequences of this sort of forced assimilation could be a bit of confusion about where Armenians stand on that spectrum of whiteness, let's say, or spectrum of, whatever you want to call it. And so Armenians come in many beautiful different forms, and the U.S. government, labels many groups white, when in reality our identity is a lot more layered and complex. So, Kohar, I guess to ask you sort of just straightforward, are Armenians white?
Just give us the answer.
I'll give you the easiest answer is we will never have an answer.
True that.
Ever. For the exact reason that it's still coming up and it has been discussed and debated for the last 100 years. It's because of the very reason that it is contested. And I think there will never be an answer for that reason. Because we do come in many different shapes and sizes, and because race is socially constructed, so it's not something that is biological, that it's not static or concrete.
Right.
It doesn't just stay the same. This is why I always repeat this on Twitter, for example. It doesn't just stay the same for 100 years because it's informed by macro and micro level processes. So both on the ground, but these big things, like, for example, what's happening abroad right now, or the Armenian genocide, or mass waves of immigration, which are, more macro level processes, but they're always interacting at the same time and informing how people perceive us and also how we perceive ourselves. So I think we could say that, yes, some Armenians, since we do come in many different shapes and sizes, some Armenians can pass as white. And I think we should acknowledge that history of, sort of being allowed entry into legal whiteness did give us an upper hand in many cases. But at the same time, I am way more interested in interrogating why it was that citizenship was exclusive in the first place.
Right.
Why aren't we questioning the structure instead of going back and forth about questions that might never have answers?
That's true.
Personally.
Very true. With that said, Kohar, why is the blanket statement that Armenians are white potentially dangerous?
I think we're seeing that exactly right now with what's happening in Artsakh and Armenia. That whiteness is in many ways, and I would say many broad racial categories, it serves as a form of erasure. It serves to conflate, to flatten, to sort of collapse all the different complexities, all the different geopolitical complexities.
To simplify.
It simplifies it, right?
Yeah.
Because first of all, it's not the truth. And you only get the truth by living the truth, in my opinion. And I think we understand it because we've obviously been in the room and we've been in these spaces and we've inherited these histories. So I think when people do make that statement, it's often a way of reading history back onto the present in a way that's inaccurate and just almost, it is erasure at its core. Yeah.
They're flawed, the social constructs and the way they, so it's almost
Absolutely.
impossible to try to define ourselves with these flawed, measures or whatever you want to call it.
It also feels like in some ways it minimizes some degree of oppression that Armenians have faced throughout history.
Right.
Yeah. I was also thinking, I think that our racial categories as well. In the U.S., we are not really good at differentiating types of migration. For example, you'll hear them say, we're all immigrants here, which is not only a form of erasure for indigenous peoples that are not immigrants who've been here since time immemorial, but I think it's a way of conveniently erasing people who are forced to come here, whether by being refugees,
slaves,
forced migration and voluntary migration. Those two things are often conflated here. And I think whiteness is a very convenient cover for that. When I don't think white people are really looking out for us, I'll be real. We've actually seen that this week very, very clearly on Twitter yesterday.
Yeah.
As an Armenian history,
people were like, why are you protesting on our country? I'm like, whoa, I have news for you.
It's our country.
Yeah, but definitely the difference between immigration, refugee status, and indigeneity are all relevant to that conversation for sure.
Well,
exactly.
But every time I see the census, we've all noticed that we get lumped into the white category. Let's say if we have to pick one, and we always end up having to pick one, there'll be a little parentheses that says North African, Middle Eastern also are included in this group. But like, random question, because I always thought about this: is there like a incentive for the government to make the proportion of Americans seem more white by including more groups? Is that, have you heard or anything?
I feel like that's exactly what it is. I think it's no coincidence that the U.S. is entirely implicated in the reason we were made, the people in that region, West Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East, whatever, that's coined, by the way, making us into refugees. I think the West is completely implicated. But at the same time, it lumps us into this, very broad racial category that, especially post 9/11, I don't think that category stands in the
Mhm.
way that it is often written. And that was made very clear on 9/11 this year when so many people came forward with all of their experiences. I saw. See, Twitter teaches me every day, but there were just like so many experiences that are completely erased by that census category.
Mhm.
And as a result, people don't prioritize us. And even in critical race, studies, people won't even include us in those in those conversations because we're not institutionally there.
Now,
Yeah.
how about the term Caucasian? Now, the Caucasus Mountains, it's in Armenia today. I'm sure the word Caucasus and Kafkas, I mean, this is an old term, but it was co-opted by German social science or like someone in Europe to describe white people, right?
Yeah.
Should Armenians call themselves Caucasian if it makes in that sense, or should they avoid using that term? What would you say, or what would you recommend?
Because I think that also contributes to the confusion about the conversation
Right.
about where Armenians fit on the spectrum of whiteness. It's like, oh, but they're Caucasian. Oh, but they're, you know what I mean? It's almost used interchangeably with
No,
white.
I
essentially.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, a term from, like, right, you said, this German quote unquote racial scientist, which is again a euphemism for scientific racism.
Yeah.
He's a eugenicist. He was a man that collected skulls.
He picked up a Georgian skull, right? Or an
Right.
Armenian skull.
A simple skull. I think that I cannot get over that is sort of the root of all of this racial confusion. A skull to name an entire people and to co-opt an entire identity.
Yeah.
So I don't think I can tell Armenians whether or not they can use the term Caucasian because those people do exist there today.
It does
you
make
know,
sense,
Sure,
yeah.
for
it's
sure.
not like that's void of people. And if
Right.
they, identify with that region and those mountains, that word has a completely different meaning and outside of the U.S.
So it
And,
should be the reverse then, and tell the non-Caucasian, let's say the European, that this term doesn't apply to you, or it
Right.
doesn't really make sense because geographically, or
which people don't know that history. So I think this year we've been trying to educate people to be like, oh, actually you're erasing a lot of the indigenous people that come from that region. But at the same time, I think it's so deeply embedded in the social fabric of this country because when you hear Caucasian, it's interchangeable with whiteness, which is interchangeable with that sort of class of power and
Right.
privilege and status. And I don't think it'll be removed from that meaning for a long time, from what I've seen. So I feel like Armenians could be aware of that social meaning and use that term as a way of educating others about us. And it's more important than ever now.
Definitely.
You reminded me of something interesting, though. We describe white as, let's say, Northern European skin color, but it's also used as the term for applying it to the powerful, to the elites, or to the privileged folk. But then we use the term white here and there, and for me sometimes it's hard to differentiate, because some white groups maybe don't get lumped or are getting lumped into the white privilege part of it. For me, I lived in Ireland, and I'm a big Irish patriot because the Irish people were one of those groups of Northern Europe that you can argue didn't have imperialism or a lot of things we criticize the rest of Northern Europe for. So would we be able to describe the difference between the race white and then white as in the powerful? Or do you think they're just interchangeably the same thing?
Right. Well, I think so actually, one of my mentors, Matthew Fried Jacobson, wrote this book, Whiteness of a Different Color, which is basically about that earliest 20th century where those racial differences at the time, the different what we think of as ethnic groups now, he sort of argued that no, those were seen as racial differences back then because of their social construction. So a lot of authors have written about how the Irish and the Italians and Jews, for example, eventually became white. But I would say in modern day, I don't really think those distinctions really exist because of the way power is constructed and the access to power that, was conferred early on. And I think a very important distinction and why I really it frustrates me sometimes to see Armenians get conflated into that same equation, is because unlike Irish and Italian people, for example, we had to petition in order to become citizens, as similar to the Chinese, the Japanese, Syrians, Indians from Asia. And of course, year to year, there were different outcomes to these cases, and Armenians were granted access, quote unquote, legally or on paper. But I think a big difference that shouldn't be understated is the fact that, Armenian refugees, this is the generation that came from the Hamidian massacres, the generation that came as a result of the Armenian genocide. So that was the generation that also had to petition for whiteness, for access or for legal whiteness. So a lot was at stake in that situation. But I think that the one thing that differentiates us and sort of draws those lines of privilege and power is the fact that, we had to petition. But that, again, our history didn't stay static.
Right.
Then I always bring up in the late 20th century, we had that new wave, or that more recent wave of immigrants, or a lot of refugees.
Yeah.
For example,
Lebanon.
from the middle, quote unquote, the Middle East, Lebanon,
Iran,
where we settled directly after the genocide. Most of us were uprooted once more. And you can't just understate that mass migration of people. These communities got so many different immigrants, and that really enlivened a lot of the cultural centers of these communities. But additionally, that changes how people perceive us racially
Right.
from the outside.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, because what brought us to petition for whiteness in the early 20th century was, being exiled or becoming refugees. You also mentioned privilege, Kohar. Can you distinguish white privilege versus the privilege that comes from being white passing?
Like legal treatment versus like real life treatment too on top of it.
Yeah. Oh, I would say we have a lot of conversations like this, specifically in the Native community, I would say we have so many identical conversations in Native communities that I'm part of, particularly when it comes to like quote unquote blood quantum and racial purity, mixture, all these different things. And I think in a lot of ways these are outcomes of genocide, and that sort of fear of losing your culture, and that's the outcome of existing in a very much an assimilative framework. But a lot of natives in the country are white passing, or are white. They're mixed with white, and we have a lot of those conversations. And I think if you can pass as white, and if you're read as white, then you have white privilege, and it's kind of as simple as that. But at the same time, I don't want to negate, the real, cultural experiences or experiences of dispossession that Armenians are still currently going through. But I think it's important to acknowledge that privilege at its core, but to understand that, that will not always protect us, dependent on where we are in the world, and that race is not just, it doesn't just stop with our imaginary borders. It's a global thing.
Right.
So that's been actually a frustration of mine when I see people being like, well, insert group, they have white privilege here. I don't think it necessarily works like that. It's not as simplified as we like to make it.
Right.
I think it is a global thing. People are moving back and forth. Families are straddled by borders. And, refugees are a thing. And I think whiteness and conversations about white privilege can often be cyclical, and we never really get to a consensus there. And I think they need to be a lot more nuanced. And I am interested in talking about white power, because I think the conversation would then be shifted to who is making these structures that continue to uphold, white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Zoom out.
Yeah, who's upholding the flawed system of
right?
race in
Or
this
who
country?
made it and whose ancestors made these structures and who inherited and is still inheriting that wealth.
Well,
You know, I feel like when we have the conversations about privilege, especially on Twitter, I've seen it in a lot of different, you know, minoritized groups will go back and forth and never reach any sort of conclusion. And I feel like white people must see those conversations as sort of scroll by, like evading that responsibility. How much more different would our conversations be if we talked more about power?
Yeah.
And I think we'd be talking about different things, and I'm more interested in that.
interesting.
I agree with that. And it's nuanced inherently, all of our experiences. So the conversation naturally should be nuanced as well.
One of the ways I would describe white privilege, though, as Armenians to, you know, other Armenians is if we changed our names to, you know, Jack and Jerry, or, you know, would you know, be just seen as an American and not as an ethnic, etc. You know, and a lot of us did do that in the past. I mean, my entire father's side has been in America since like 1907. They've been here for a long time, and they all now they don't speak any Armenian for the most part. They all have non-Armenian names. My father's name is Tony. My grandparents are Jack and Sandra, and everyone in the family has American names. And so, I mean, this assimilation and a structure of race in this country has personally affected my family and our you know, us trying to keep Armenian alive. And it was for that recent wave of immigrants that revived my personal family, right? It's different now. We're lucky.
Yeah. Well, let's bring up Kim K.
Yeah, that's
her
actually
family
a great way.
did come during that time period. And I think, you know, that is a very clear example of what you might call white privilege or access to whiteness, because, you know, during that time period, the stakes were so high that access to whiteness was citizenship and ownership of land, or ability to own land and sort of participate in, you know, the civic structure of this country. So in a way, yeah, I think definitely it's historically rooted in that Americanization period. So you bring up a good point there.
Well, isn't it interesting that Kim Kardashian tends to be like the way to address this subject, at least?
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about an Armenian spiel, oftentimes she comes up in the conversation, even if it's not on my end. You know, they're like, "Oh, like the Kardashians."
Well, that is actually going back to my first question, actually, about like what would we tell a non-Armenian about Armenians? I'd be like, well, Kardashian, you know her, like her, you know, and that would usually work because now that's someone that everyone knows in this country, and they could connect. Okay, what does she look like?
Especially if you're in a rush, it's just like a quick.
What's the easiest way to do it? Do you know Cher? No, you don't know System of a Down? No. Okay. How about Kim Kardashian? Like you try to like see if you have other options before that one, but you've already kind of talked about the history of whiteness in this country specifically. Could you give us some more, like, the details of Halagian and Kartouzian, like the two big Armenian cases that fought for our right to be white in this country? Could you give us a brief description and maybe like how that court or the battle in court kind of went down?
Yeah. So, in Injury Halagian took place in 1909, and Armenians were deemed white by law in that case. I actually can read directly from the newspaper in the Boston Herald that was published on December 25th, 1909, which read, "Armenians have always been reckoned as Caucasians and white persons, that the outlook of their civilization has been toward Europe, that the word white has generally been used in the federal and in the state statutes, in the publications of the United States, and in its classification of its inhabitants to include all persons not otherwise classified, that Armenians," listen here, "as well as Syrians and Turks, have been freely naturalized in this court until now, although the statutes in this respect have stood substantially unchanged since the first Congress, that the word white, as used in the statutes, publications, and classifications above referred to, those meaning has narrowed to exclude Chinese and Japanese, in some instances still includes Armenians." So
Wow.
exactly what I
Tea.
said about the time period. It's really awful. A lot of these things are just actually.
They
You want
didn't.
to see what I have?
They didn't know anything back then, and they were so sure of themselves making these decisions.
Oh my gosh, tell me about it. It really is. I don't even know. Once you read the the rhetoric of the cases, it'll disillusion you,
Yeah,
and
it's
it'll
another
make
universe.
you realize
Yeah.
none of it's real. It's all, of course, very real, and it structured all of our experiences and how we were able, for all these different groups, how we were able to exist in this country until now. Like, we are still living in the shadow and this aftermath of these cases.
Yeah.
And you can see that very clearly. And I think, so the way these court cases were decided, really kind of was dependent in the year. So Indri Ellis was in 1910. Syrians were deemed eligible for naturalization. And in some other cases, they were not deemed eligible. And it would really depend on the year. And it shows how socially constructed and how contested these cases were at the time. It's important to view these cases relationally, because at the time, a lot of Syrians and Armenians that were coming here were Christian, including the Syrian people that came here. And I think our Christianity had everything to do with the fact that we were allowed into this country. And you can see that very clearly when you look at the relationship between, for example, Protestant missionaries that went to the Ottoman Empire to convert Armenians and eventually brought some Armenians to cities like Worcester and other, industrial centers in what is now New England. But I think it had everything to do with our ability to assimilate and to be sort of more palatable for white audiences, and different from everything that was, to the east of us.
Well, so why was there a second case then with Kartouzian in the 20s or 30s or earlier?
So U.S. v. Kartouzian was in 1925, and I just have to plug this incredible book that really goes into this history. It's Nera Mahvoule's Limits of Whiteness. Let me read the very last part. It's about Iranian Americans and the everyday politics of race. But I think that is, the sort of closest example. And she does an amazing job through sort of interviews with her community, and it's very much situated in the present. But it goes into the depths of how even our court case, U.S. v. Kartouzian, shaped how Iranian people are perceived in the U.S. today. Because these things are connected. Such a broad way of, sort of declaring an entire group white by law. What are the implications of that in general? So in U.S. v. Kartouzian, it took place in 1925. It took place in Oregon, actually. And I'm pretty sure you could go, so into detail and read this. I think their family had a sort of rug industry, and the daughter was very avid in, advocating for Armenians at the time. But when it got to the court, it was this way of sort of performing whiteness and saying, we speak English. And this is also during the Americanization period, if we want to call it that. But we speak English, we are good Americans because of these sort of things.
We are from the Caucasus, therefore Caucasian. I'm sure that worked out for them too.
No, exactly. That had everything to do with it. And, it's crazy reading it back now from the present. You can see that so very clearly in the conversations that pop up on Twitter every month. That logic is exactly what happened. So I was going to say, I actually have U.S. v. Kartouzian. Look at this. Right here.
Wow.
What is this book?
This
is the whole case?
April 5th, 1924. This is the sort of written record of this whole testimony.
Oh.
And I actually didn't even look too deeply into it until this year when I realized I was able to have it and get, access to the written record. But I will say this sounds like Twitter right here. because it's really just non-Armenians going back and forth, and specifically what they called like anthropologists, quote unquote, but they're really like a lot of the racial scientists, scientific racism, don't forget that, not a valid thing, eugenicists that were going on about, have Armenians intermarried, have Armenians assimilated, are they like us? And I'm summing it up, but that really is at the core of this case.
Damn.
Oh, I just opened. As the terms white and white persons are commonly and popularly used in the United States and Canada, would you class the Armenians, in your opinion, as white persons? And that was a question asked by a non-Armenian or white man to another white man for his sort of scientific, opinion.
He's probably just looking at the guy. He's like thinking,
exactly.
I wonder.
And there was no basis of this, scientific racism, except for that it was racist.
Yeah, no joke.
I want to say one more thing about this case, that this is crazy. So have you ever heard, I'll say it is a myth, first of all, the myth that we originated in Europe.
Wait, what? Say it again?
So basically, I've seen Armenians say this very casually. So instead of, the truth that we are indigenous to, where we come from.
We're originally from Europe.
The Armenian highlands. So during this time period, a lot of these anthropologists put forth, I think it was actually an older theory from, sort of antiquity. But it is, for example, it has now been disproved, not only by Armenian sources, but also by genetics and our, all of our oral histories and our testimonies and archaeology, for example. That's been something that indigenous people have to rely on because people, won't really believe us, whatever we say. But this whole case was basically founded on this myth that we originated in Europe, and like the Caucasian people originated there and migrated and eventually settled in what is now that region.
This is
where
what
we
I'm
come
saying.
from.
They have, like, for the last 100 years, we've learned so much more, and the fact that they're making all these like really concrete like decisions based on what's their very weak science. No, I mean, I was thinking maybe it's connected to the Indo-European factor of it all, like the language. Maybe they're trying to connect it that way, but who knows? Maybe anyways, it's if anyone brings that up today, it's most likely them trying to get at some sort of, I don't know, white supremacist kind of like angle. So luckily that's not very relevant thing. I haven't really heard that too much today anymore. But what I was gonna say earlier is, my grandpa was the darker one of the family, and his brother was lighter, and this is in the 40s and 50s or 30s, 40s, let's say 10 years after these cases, and he wouldn't be let into the pools. Like his brother could go into the public pool, but my grandpa couldn't. And according to my grandparents back in East LA, Armenians weren't allowed to live in certain areas. That we had some sort of redlining too, right, where they had to live in Boyle Heights. They couldn't do certain occupations. I know in the Fresno Armenians were limited to agriculture. Meanwhile, my family, the LA Armenians at that time, were limited to the rubbish industry.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is, of course, I mean, everything is connected, right? And so a lot of what we talk about is intersectional, especially when we zoom out. And so, Kohar, I wanted to ask if you can explain how both Armenians and other minorities benefited greatly from the civil rights movement as it was, and civil rights legislation as well.
Or minorities in general as a whole. And I'd actually be interested in a native twist, like an angle as well.
Yeah. Well, right. I think the civil rights movement, for example, is often, again, a period that has since been overwritten. We'll still see those black and white pictures as if it wasn't within this generation that is still very much alive. And the sort of, again, friendly encounter, very peaceful encounter. But now this is a very revolutionary, radical time, very much like one we are living in right now, I would say, where you not only had the civil rights movement when it came to the sort of more peaceful, accommodationist ideologies of Martin Luther King, which is often the face of this movement. But then you had the more radical Black Panther movement and Black Power movement, Black Panther Party, I meant. But you also had the Asian American movement, American Indian movement, AIM, and the Chicano movement. This was the critical time for the formation of ethnic studies, what we call ethnic studies today, or, critical race theory.
Yeah.
It was born out of activism during this time period, during the late 20th century, where people were organizing on the ground to be like, we aren't represented in the classroom. We aren't represented, really anywhere. We want to sort of represent ourselves on our own terms. And as a result, you had the formation of many different departments: African American Studies, Native American Studies, Asian American Studies, and Latin American Studies, for example, during this time period in this late period. And I've been thinking about how, again, Swana activism is often elided and erased from those conversations. And I don't think it wasn't happening. I just don't think it's really represented, and we don't really have too much of a written record of that other than our oral histories. But I do think we have definitely learned so much from Black and Indigenous activism in this country that has been, playing out since its foundation, since its very racist foundation. Black and Native people have never stopped resisting to survive, fighting for their survival, fighting for our survival, because we're, existing here today, and building this country. But yeah, I definitely, Haig, as we were actually talking about earlier, I think it really changed the conversation from this assimilation basis. Not saying those logics don't still exist, because I think they definitely still do, and they're definitely still the norm. But I think in the 90s, we entered this sort of period of multiculturalism that is still often masked as a sort of colorblind period. But I think it allowed us to sort of come here and be able to openly embrace our roots.
Yeah, I agree.
Our families, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I personally believe what the African Americans did for their own rights really ended up helping everybody who wanted to be on equal footing with the white man, or being, wanting to retain their heritage and not feeling discriminated because their name might be different or their religion is different, or all these things.
And the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act also benefited, what it did also benefited other groups as well. And so I think
there's
definitely
direct
can't
and
be
indirect
understated.
connections there, and we have a lot to be appreciative of all those activists back then.
Right, like shutting down the freeway. That's a thing that Black activists did this year, have done many different times. And sort of, I think we've learned a lot. Not that Armenians have not been protesting, because that's one thing Armenians are, and I've been watching a lot of the videos, we're so good at protesting and gathering and just showing up. But I think like a lot of the methods of protest, whether it's blocking the freeway and like disrupting different spaces, I think we obviously take a lot from Black radicalism.
Right. Well, let me ask you this then. I was thinking about this the other day. Now, there's videos of the Armenians, protesting on the freeway, protesting here and there. Now, let's switch the Armenians with an African-American group or another group. Would the police have been acted the same way with the Armenians than they do with the African-Americans? Like, I was there, like, in my head, I'm like, this might be part of that privilege that we have, that, they see us as a lot less they're not less afraid of us or whatever. They see us as less of a danger, so they're willing to let us block the freeway or do this or that. Meanwhile, I'm thinking back to June and July with the BLM protests, and even though they were peaceful off the bat, they were like met with hostility or with the SWAT teams. So
absolutely, that's white privilege speaking. Like that's exactly what we're talking about, or not necessarily white privilege, but that is a privilege to not.
There's a difference there. Yeah,
for sure.
Deal with that police brutality, and not saying that we don't in different cases. I don't want to make a blanket statement,
of course.
But again, that is a very important specificity.
Yeah. On that note, as a people, Armenians as a people with such a tragic history time and time again. I mean, I was thinking about it the other day, even our songs, so many of them are so beautifully tragic.
Yeah.
Because we understand what it's like to struggle and what it's like to struggle in pursuit of justice, fighting against assimilation, and to be driven by that cause over the years. And I don't understand why or how some Armenians can choose not to support Black justice or other causes. I can't absorb it. Why do you think some Armenians don't see themselves as maybe allies to others? Why is solidarity not, a given?
Right. I have those same confusions, but I think it very much has to do with the conversations we had when it comes to legal whiteness and that history that we've inherited and all those ideologies. And it's many different things, but for example, I think we've internalized a lot of white supremacy. I've been thinking about this too. Not only that, but I think we've internalized, Turkish supremacy as well, if I could say that. That's kind of controversial, but when I hear some rhetoric about how Armenian people who have no connection to what is now Turkey, how they talk about, Turkey, I think we often forget that there are still so many Armenians that live there.
Yeah.
That are hidden and aren't safe to really be as they are. I realize that is an outcome of the genocide and all of those pan-Turkic ideologies that we were also forced to assimilate into for centuries, obviously culminating in the genocide. I just feel like it's a combination of so many things.
What advice would you give to Armenians then in terms of like proper allyship, or how should we go about creating connections with these communities in terms of in terms of their activism? It shouldn't be transactional, right? We shouldn't be going in with the thought that I'm gonna do this because I want something back. Would you say it should be unconditional or with conditions? That tends to be a theme that comes up.
Right, exactly. I don't think activism is as hard as we make it out to be, or these inter-ethnic, interracial solidarity networks or coalitions. I think the most successful ones are rooted in friendship. Yeah. And that's one thing I've definitely realized, through the years. We make it, or I think we like to talk about it, in these very abstract, complex ways. Not saying it's not complex and,
I know
not a complex thing. But at the same time, if you have friends and you go out of your way to really learn about where someone comes from, and you take the time to open yourself up to these experiences and really just care for others, I don't think it's as hard as we make it to be. And
Definitely.
People just overwrite that to be like, we're on our own. But I'm like, meanwhile, people that are actually, there are so many of us that are actually friends with so many different groups, and we are actively, and obviously me as, a mixed race person, being Black, Indigenous, and Armenian, I understand the necessity of, these coalitions or these friendships.
No, that's a great way of putting the,
It's like just care. It's pretty straightforward.
Right.
At the end of the day, it's just a lot of us vulnerable against these long-lasting structures, right? And so, I don't know. In my,
it almost seems impossible. You mean like these big the structures, institutions that are too big to break, and
they feel big. They feel. I mean, they are. But I bring that up to say, like, all of us are against those structures, and that's why I, hope and dream about, solidarity for anyone that faces any level of oppression, because we all understand to some degree what that feels like, and if you've experienced it, then you should want betterment for not only yourself but for anyone that's experienced that same degree or any degree of that same feeling.
every time always talked about Armenia in middle school and high school, my poor teachers and friends, but I always made an
Same.
effort to learn how to say hello, how are you in their language, whoever I met, whether it was Pashto or Spanish or whatever, because I knew what it would make me feel like if they said Pare vinci peses, that would make me so happy. So I was like, I'm gonna learn theirs. And then maybe from me showing interest in their background, they would get interested in my background. So it was
Right.
and that's the friendships I've been making over the last few years, is by me ingraining in their community and getting involved and learning about them. It does reciprocate, but maybe it's based off of the fact that you've become good friends at this point and you've accepted their backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, someone asked me the other day, like, why is activism important? And I just said, if you care about people, then you should care about activism, because that's what it is. It's
Right.
literally caring about people and using any sense of agency or in different ways to help them. Like, I don't know. It just seems
Exactly.
I would
simple.
recommend. Not many of us Armenians live in areas where, we do go to a public school and we don't have many Armenian friends in our area. So off the bat, they're exposed to the greater communities around us. But there's a lot of Armenians that will also withhold on, they'll stay in their bubbles.
Yeah. It's a disservice to ourselves, but to each other, because our histories are always relational. Our histories and our current realities are always relational. They're always connected.
Yeah.
They don't exist in vacuums.
Mhm.
And our job is to just sort of fill in and sort of understand how they all connect, and then bridge on the basis of our similarities and sort of build these networks across our differences. And that is really, sort of the root of people that study race relationally, or very much understand that things are intersectional at their core. Because if not, that's just not how life works.
Yeah.
Race is global and intersectional at its core because it was made to be that way. And I think, for example, if we're going to bring up ethnic studies and that formation and how that's connected to the civil rights movement, everything is always already related. So by pretending that, or putting on these narrow goggles and thinking that we only have ourselves, I don't think that serves anyone well.
Yeah.
True.
I would always, my argument for why, when my friends would ask, why do you care about the Armenian genocide, or why is that relevant to us? I'd say, if we can achieve our justice, it's a format or a model for everyone to achieve their justice. Fighting for one person's justice is fighting for your own justice. Well,
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
Well,
Right.
Kohar,
May I also say,
yeah, go for it.
the eradication of all the injustices against Black and Indigenous women would require the liberation of all, because, this country was built on our dispossession.
Yeah.
So in order to sort of grant us that freedom, that would require everyone to be free,
Yeah,
because, this hierarchy was sort of formed on top of us.
for sure.
Well, so
So yeah, a rendition of that quote, but to say Black and Indigenous liberation is at the root of all, and it has to be, because it's a global system here.
No, it's
Absolutely.
true. And if we can achieve it here with our African American and Native American brothers and sisters, we can then take that model to Turkey whenever the genocide gets recognized, and we try to figure it out there with them.
Which is why 105 years later, we still talk about the Armenian genocide, because, as you said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that's why we raise awareness in hopes of also preventing these things from
Right.
recurring. Kohar, thank you so much for joining us today and chatting with us.
Yeah, this was great. Pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, of course, and good luck at school and everything.
Thanks, I need it.
Zoom University.
Yes, and we can't wait to have you back hopefully soon.
Yes.
Ooh, thank you.
We live in a world shaped by European society. As a result of their extensive conquests and colonizations, our world is shaped through the European lens of economics, sciences, as well as their notions and theories about people and race and history, which were institutionalized. And even though much of it's grossly inaccurate, The perceptions and constructs we experience about people who look different than us, especially in the West, come from this small corner of the world's ideas of white superiority and power.
The blanket statement that Armenians are white is problematic. There are advantages and there's privilege to being white passing, of course. But the truth is, the Armenian story and experience has little to do with European imperialism and the power of being quote-unquote white. Having just survived a genocide, many of us had to accommodate our identities to be acceptable to Western standards in order to seek refuge and start a new life. Being predominantly Christian helped with conforming in the mostly Christian West, but that very same cultural characteristic is why we were brutally persecuted and forced to leave in the first place. The answer is not simple, and it demands context. But if Armenians are quote-unquote white, are Arabs, Iranians, and all Swana people also white? We all answer the census the same way.
Let's decolonize our minds. Ask yourself, is this perception of myself or the other based on a racist scientist 200 years ago who knew nothing about Armenians or about themselves for that matter? The difficulty of trying to categorize ethnic groups from our part of the world where every color and religion and type of person exists only proves the inherent complexity of identity. It's too complex for the arbitrary classification made by those very same racist European scientists from 200 years ago. So I hope this show will help our community add more context to these conversations. And I agree with Kohar that instead of trying to fit ourselves in these arbitrary and flawed categories, the conversation should shift to who's upholding and creating these systems that incorporate these consequential racial categorizations.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Haitug Talks, the official podcast of the AYF West. I'm Krista Marina Apardian.
And I'm Haik Minasyan.
And we're just a couple of Armenians.
Talking in the world.
A couple of Armenians talking in the world.